What's going on, guys? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today I am back with the Dreamcade Replay and I want to test out some Sega Dreamcast games and some Sega Saturn games. To be perfectly clear with this video, they don't say anything about Sega Saturn being playable on this unit on their website at all. They do offer Dreamcast as a downloadable core or a downloadable emulator. It does use NullDC, which is an older emulator. It actually hasn't been updated since 2010, so there are a lot of games that have a bunch of glitches in them. We're going to get into it. I'm going to test a few games with NullDC, and then I'm going to go ahead and run Redream, which is one of my new favorite Dreamcast emulators. We're going to see if it will perform any better than NullDC on the Dreamcade Replay. But before we get started, I just want to give you a little rundown on the specs. We have a Celeron dual-core J3355 at 2 GHz. It will turbo up to 2.4. 4 GB of DDR3 1333 MHz RAM, and an Intel HD 500 GPU. If you're not really familiar with the Dreamcade Replay, I just did an unboxing video of the final production unit. Go ahead and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. Basically, it's a mini Windows 10 PC with the Dreamcade front end here. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and test some Dreamcast games. First up, Soul Calibur. You can make this go total full screen. I have messed around with the settings a little bit to leave my bar at the very top. The FPS is listed in the top right hand corner and the top left hand corner. I'm using Fraps with the yellow one over in the top right. It's not affecting CPU whatsoever. It's only there for the FPS reader. So like I mentioned, NullDC is pretty old. There are some known issues with a lot of games. Like Soul Calibur here, for instance. If you check out the health bars up at the very top, they do flash a lot, and sometimes you even see them go behind the scenery. There will be a lot of games you can play perfectly on the Dreamcade Replay using NullDC, but you will run into some games with compatibility issues and this emulator. Some games just won't run well at all in NullDC. Other than the health bar issue, this seems to be performing really well. 60 FPS, looks good. If you can get by those health bars flashing and going behind scenery, you should be fine with this. Next up, my favorite fighting game of all time, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and this is actually my favorite port on the Dreamcast. It's not running well at all. We should be at 60 FPS. I have the same exact settings that I did when I played Soul Calibur. We are at 47, 50 FPS, goes up and down every once in a while. I will retest this in the Redream emulator in just a second, but I want to get a few more games out of the way with NullDC first. Here's Sonic Adventure 2. NullDC does have a few issues with this also. You'll see some black bars coming up and down here. Another thing about this game, I cannot leave the sound on because it is copywritten music. I will turn the sound off right about now. So far we've been at about 60 FPS. It's going to drop down here very shortly. I would rather not play this game than have to deal with the glitches and the low FPS. That's just how I feel about Dreamcast games. And here's Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio, whatever you want to call it. As you can see, it's performing pretty well. I did have to turn the music off, but the music does sound pretty good here. I didn't get too far into this game. It's not that hard to run, and it is compatible with a lot of these Dreamcast emulators. And as you can see, the Dreamcade and NullDC are actually handling this pretty well. Now I'm going to move over to the Redream emulator. This is a newer Dreamcast emulator on the market. I'm only going to test one game here because the Dreamcade really doesn't have the power to push this emulator to its potential. We're going to go back with Marvel vs. Capcom 2. FPS is in the top right hand corner. Now this is very CPU dependent. The Dreamcade Replay will run at up to 2.4 GHz, but most of the time I see it at 2.2, 2.3. if this thing had a 2.7 GHz CPU, I guarantee you it would run this emulator at full speed. Right now, we're a little on the low side. So basically, I mean, the Dreamcade Replay does a lot of stuff pretty well with emulation, but Dreamcast really isn't one of them. Dreamcast and Gamecube are going to struggle on this unit. There are several different Dreamcast emulators you can test, but NullDC seems to be the best for lower end systems. I have tested a ton of mini PCs. If you check out my channel, I have done reviews on about 26 different mini PCs with different Celeron CPUs. I already knew kind of right off the bat that it wasn't going to do Dreamcast and Gamecube very well. There are some games in Dreamcast and Gamecube that are playable, but don't buy one specifically for Gamecube and Dreamcast. Now it's time to test out some Sega Saturn emulation. I'm using Yoba Senshiro. This is kind of an offshoot of the older Yobasi emulator. The developer has taken this under his wing and he's done a great job with it. The performance has increased from the older emulator, but it's still not completely there yet. I only have a few games here that'll even launch on the system, so we're only going to test about 3 games. To be fair, the developers of the Dreamcade have mentioned nothing about Sega Saturn emulation. So I started off with a pretty easy one here. This is Radiant Silvergun. I have run this on a lot of systems and it seems to perform very well. This should be at a continuous 60 FPS. I do have the internal resolution of this emulator set as low as it can go to get the best performance out of it. We're only at 43 FPS. Now there are other Sega Saturn emulators out there, but they do require a faster CPU than the Dreamcade Replay has. That's why I went with this emulator here. By the way, the reason it is not full screen right now is because I'm having an issue with it. It kind of offsets the picture a little bit. I'm not sure if it's the Intel HD GPU built in or it's something to do with the emulator itself, but the other Yobasi emulator, the older one, does the same thing. This game is Sega Rally, and we should be at 50 to 60 FPS. I do have it set to NTSC, so it should be running at 60. I know the original Sega Saturn hardware did have some dips here and there. We're only at 43 to 48 FPS here. It's not the best, but this game is playable. I don't know how many people are still going to want to play this, but it's nice to be able to emulate Sega Saturn games at full speed. And unfortunately, the Dreamcade Replay just doesn't have a strong enough CPU to run Saturn games at full speed. The final game I want to test in this whole video is Virtua Fighter 2. This is a harder game to emulate with any Sega Saturn emulator. Very low FPS. Everything is set to the lowest you can go. I'm using OpenGL, which is the best renderer right now that's built in. He is working on a Vulkan plugin. It's not available yet. So overall, performance is not great in Dreamcast and Sega Saturn, and I'm not trying to downplay what the Dreamcade Replay can really do, because it can do a lot. I just want people to understand exactly what they're getting when they purchase something like this. This is not a supercomputer. It has a low-end Celeron CPU with built-in Intel HD graphics. Now this is perfect for N64, SNES, NES, TurboGrafx, MAME, Apple, Apple II, Amiga, Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, Sega Genesis, Sega Master System, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. It'll even probably do Nintendo DS pretty well. There are thousands of retro games that are going to play perfectly on this unit, but do not expect this to play GameCube, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, PlayStation 2, Wii U, PS3. It will not do those emulators very well. In some of those emulators, yes, there are a few games that work well, but it will not play a full library. This even does PSP pretty well, except for a few select games like God of War Chains of Olympus, Midnight Club, and Fallout Liberation. I do plan on doing a few more videos on this unit. I want to test out some 3DO and some other games. I've had a lot of requests to test stuff out on here, and I will eventually make those videos, but it does take a little while to get everything put together. In the meantime, if you haven't checked out my unboxing video on the final production unit, link is in the description and on screen now. I really do appreciate you guys watching. If you could, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on so you know when I upload my next video, and like always, thanks for watching.